To understand the U.S. debt, it's helpful to start from the very beginning. A nation fresh off the Boston Tea Party was ready for war, but needed financing. In walks France, ready to finance the enemy of their enemy. And rich American merchants that seen the upside to war was ready to invest too. With these steps out the way, the U.S. began printing money to finance the war. The soldiers paid and supplies in hand, it's time to start the war. The next couple of years saw the battles really intensify. This intensity meant more supplies, more shoes, more boots, more food for the troops, more money. This demand caused more printing, which caused more inflation. The young nation will soon find out. The journals of Congress from the time period speak of a depreciated currency that required the physical reduction of the currency. The new currency will now be rated 40-1 to the Spanish meal. Soldiers would watch the currency go worthless right in front of their eyes. And widows whose husbands died at battle was left with worthless currency. Things got so bad, the military was paid in IOU certificates. With the currency in shambles, enters Robert Morris. America's richest man would use his own personal credit and name to pay for bills going forward. It was a success, and in 1783, the war was over. But the war on poverty will begin for most soldiers. These hard times would cause them to sell their certificates for pennies on the dollar. The Constitution would soon be signed, and Alexander Hamilton would become the treasurer. The man pictured on the $10 bill would make a game-changing new law, the Funding Act of 1790. To the soldiers' surprise, this act would restore the value of the certificates they sold at discounts. They effectively transferred their wealth and changed U.S. debt ownership forever. Alexander Hamilton would use the first central bank of the United States to perform these exploitative transactions, which would be owned by Britain a few years after its opening, leaving many feeling like the war was fought for no reason. Britain owning the Central Bank of America eventually led to its closing in 1811. Across the pond, France and Britain were readying themselves for war against each other. UK ships even began looting American ships for supplies. Native American and Britain alliances even started being formed. It was under this vein the die was cast. The decision was made. The U.S. was back in war in 1812. The war would end 3 years later, but the biggest winner were the banks. With no central banks, the state banks, being the only show in town, proved profitable. Too profitable. Soon, America will have its second central bank. Enters Andrew Jackson, a man not a fan of central banks. He earned his bones in the War of 1812. With trained experience in removing Native Americans from Georgia, he had absolutely no problem in signing the Indian Removal Act. He knew that these vacant lands can be sold to plantation owners for profit. He got the profit, paid off debt, and voila, the U.S. was debt free. With the second bank officially closed down and Indian removal continuing through the U.S., a lot of land was paid for in paper money, causing inflation. The response was to require land purchases in gold and silver. This backfired and went on to cause the Panic of 1837. Plantations that were once successful were now being foreclosed on. This would lead banks to be slave owners for a time period. The success of the railroad industry started to change things. Success, coupled with manifest destiny, had America back at war with Mexico. The war with Mexico would eventually lead to the annexation of Texas. Westward expansion became the move. This would be slowed down by the failure of a northern insurance company. Their failure would cause major unemployment in the North. And with the South still rebounding from the Panic of 1837, the chessboard was set. Will the West go to the South or to the North? With the Dred Scott decision, the writing was on the wall. The West will go to the South. It was in this hostile North versus South climate steps Abraham Lincoln. A month after his election, the nation was at war again, but this time with itself. The importance of not going to war unless your money is right was well known. So the greenbacks were issued to ready the country for war. The South would also issue their own currency called the grayback. The National Banking Act would be signed, giving the greenback a leg up. The North was now financed properly. They outnumbered and outsupplied the South. The effects of war would significantly devalue the currency, but the North still dominated in industry and manpower. This would lead to the eventual victory of the North, ending slavery, the graybacks, and any Confederate bonds. Slavery at the time was the biggest asset in the U.S. 40 acres and a mule, Southern debt obligations, never recognized. Slavery was no longer the top asset in the U.S. It was now trains. But before this industry can take off, there was one more magic trick. Remember the greenbacks that lost significant value during the war? Well, similar to the Revolutionary War, families were forced to sell these at quarters on the dollar to make ends meet. Well, investors would take this depreciated currency and buy certificates that bear interest. In 1869, Ulysses S. Grant will acknowledge these certificates, proving for the second time in American history it's investors over people. This capital would be used to fuel the railroad expansion and consolidate corporate power. This would eventually lead to the Great Railroad Bubble, which would eventually pop. And a few years after the Civil War, the nation was back in a panic. This panic would wipe out the Freedmen Bank entirely. With assets going for cheap, smart lawyers invented the trust. The game was slightly changing a little bit, and oil was becoming a top asset. John D. Rockefeller would use this in a combination of trust to become the richest man in America. Other titans would expand in this era, known as the Gilded Age, to start the American ultra-rich. By 1900, the ultra-rich would own 50% of the nation's wealth. Income inequality would soon become a huge discussion point. So much so, the income tax was started in 1913 to tax the ultra-rich. Everyday Americans were excluded. Also in this year, the third central bank of America would be started, the Federal Reserve Bank. Across the pond, there will soon be a major assassination. This would lead to the First World War. The Zimmerman Note would be intercepted and the U.S. will join the war. Learning from the Civil War, the U.S. issued Liberty bonds to finance the war. This was enough to mobilize the troops and eventually win the First World War. With the post-war economy in shambles, everyday Americans was forced to sell their Liberty bonds. Selling these bonds at a discount will come back to hurt the everyday American. They will soon get to see their federal government fully acknowledge the Liberty Bond. This surprised most Americans because the government was recently cash-strapped. And for the third time in the history of the country, it was investors over people. After the wealth transfer, the Roaring Twenties started. The invention of the phonograph made music a household commodity. America's pastime sport was alive and active. Everything was good until it wasn't. In 1929, the stock market crashed, triggering the Great Depression. Enters Franklin D. Roosevelt with a plan to save the economy. His plan included putting Americans back to work at scale. He would also establish Social Security for the working class man and woman. Similar to World War I, the world was at war while the U.S. stayed out of it. This would change with the attack at Pearl Harbor. The Revenue Act of 1942 would serve as the tool to finance this war. Income taxes would now be levied on anybody making more than $500. Big battles with big bills continued. But Allied troops held strong and the war was won. Post-World War II saw massive expansion in the U.S. economy. Cheap oil was helping fuel this economic boom. The car industry was alive and thriving. Music was touching the hearts of the baby boomers. Sports were shown on all TVs within the American households. Sprinkle in the Vietnam War, you could say things were going well. But oil will soon become the biggest problem. And the passing of Medicare would cause healthcare inflation, which is still felt today. And ending gold convertibility turned the US dollar to a legitimate fiat currency. The 70s opened up with a major increase in oil prices in the Middle East. Gas companies became even richer, charging Middle Eastern prices for American gas. Oil became so powerful that the petrodollar was established. Added on top of this was the Federal Reserve decision to increase interest rates. The US dollar became so expensive that the Midwest factories were destroyed. It went from the steel belt to the rust belt. Under this vein enters former TV star Ronald Reagan. With an increased spend in military for the Cold War and the signing of the Comprehensive Crime Control Act, sprinkle in Medicare changes that turn hospitals into profit-maximizing corporations, also with a significant tax cut for the super rich, Reaganomics was in full swing. The 90s was more of the same. Healthcare costs continued to increase. Tough on-crime bills continued to raise a cost. But the feather in the cap for the 90s was the dot-com boom. The internet was on its way. The 2000s started with an internet crash. The dot-com bubble had popped. Wall Street also started turning mortgages into derivative securities, which led to a housing boom. The Twin Towers would be knocked down, leading to a 20-year war. More tax cuts for the rich will be enacted, and you guessed it, healthcare costs continue to increase. But remember the Wall Street mortgage derivatives from the year 2000? Well, people defaulted on these loans, and the complexities of derivatives had far-reaching impacts. Big banks were in a position to default and lose trillions. But unlike the Revolutionary War veterans or the Black Americans that left 250 years of slavery without a dime, or the millions of families that fell victim to predacious subprime lending practices, U.S. debt would be used to save, rehab, and repair the banking institutions. The next 9 years will show the chickens starting to come home to roost. Long, and I mean very long-term war spending. And you guessed it, healthcare costs continue to increase. Continual tax cuts on corporations and the super rich. Decades of borrowing led to a very high interest rate. We were paying a lot of money to our foreign and domestic investors. The U.S. officially couldn't afford itself. It became a country for wealthy to park billions of dollars and receive a guaranteed return. The 2020s started with COVID-19, which shut the country down. This led to massive PPP loans and stimulus checks. But this would cause inflation. The double cheeseburger at McDonald's went from $1.89 in 2020 to $3.23 in 2026. This inflation would lead to another increase in interest rates. And for the first time in history, America is paying more in interest than it's paying for its military. As we move towards 2027, the debt is already increasing. Buckle up, because the roller coaster ride looks like it's picking up. But there is a lion ready to awaken, and a silver lining to the story. America, the most racially and ethnically diverse place in the world, have the capabilities through the people to manage itself. And maybe, just maybe, we can establish what Ray Charles called America the Beautiful. I am Lamar Jones. This is Uptown Accounting Group. Thank you for joining.